All right, well, I'll go ahead and start. I just wanted to, first of all, say a few things just about procedure for the talk. If you could all please mute your videos and microphone except for the speaker, that'll just help to keep the bandwidth strong so that we don't have any connectivity issues. And so you're welcome to send questions through the chat during the talk, and we'll come to those afterwards during the question and answer session. And that will probably go past 11. And if for those of you who can stay longer, looking forward to that discussion. And at that time, you can just unmute your video and ask your question. That usually works fine. This is also being recorded and will be posted on the department's YouTube channel afterwards. So welcome to the Anthropology Colloquium series at the University of New Mexico. Today, our speaker is Nicholas Q. Emlen. He is incoming assistant professor at the University of Groningen at the Friesland campus in the Netherlands, beginning in 2022. He's a linguistic anthropologist whose research in the southern Peruvian Andes straddles a number of boundaries. His first book, Language, Coffee, and Migration on an Andean Amazonian Frontier, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2020, is an insightful and ethnographically rich description of a thoroughly trilingual agricultural frontier, and at the same time offers a compassionate and unsettling glimpse into the everyday dynamics of coffee cultivation and environmental devastation on the edge of the Amazonian rainforest. Throughout the book, however, many questions about the history of language contact also come to the surface. And in the past years, Emlen's research has turned more fully in this direction. And in his current position as a postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University Center for Linguistics, he's collaborated on the reconstruction of Quechua-Aymara language contact in the ancient Central Andes, and on multilingualism among Quechua, Aymara, Bukina, and Spanish in the Colonial Andes. And this work has already challenged received wisdom about the history and prehistory of Andean languages, helping to sift out ideas about Andean languages and speakers that are a pernicious legacy of colonization. And finally, I can't introduce Nick without also thanking him for his friendship and conversation while we were both graduate students at the University of Michigan and while trying to plan our respective research projects in Peru. And I remember meeting in Cusco at a point where we were both reaching out from Cusco to different parts of Peru, Nick going off to the Andean Amazonian frontier and myself going north to the region of Ancash. And it's great to come together again and to hear about where those paths have led him. And so I turn over to Nick.
Okay, well, thank you, Josh, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming. Yes, indeed. The talk that I'm going to give today is Hearing the Voice of an Aymara Speaker in a 17th Century Text from Peru. And this is a project that I'm working on now. It began during a fellowship at the John Carter Brown Library, where I had the opportunity to use Aymara language texts, and this project has now grown. And so I want to talk a little bit about what my colleagues and I are doing with this project. The text that I'm going to talk about is called the Vita Christi, and was published in the Aymara language in 1612 on the shores of Lake Titicaca, which is this lake here. It's a remarkable book. It is the longest text that we have written in the Aymara language from the colonial period. But what makes it so interesting is that it was composed by an Aymara speaker rather than by a European. And so it's really offers some interesting perspectives onto the way that language was used in the early colonial period, and much else besides that I'd like to talk about. So I want to structure this today by just by briefly reviewing the context of indigenous writing in the colonial Andes. Then I want to talk about the composition of this text, how it came to be. I want to then turn to some of the interesting linguistic features of this text. I have several of them to talk about, and we'll just see how the time is. Maybe I won't get to all of them. And then I want to talk a little bit about the afterlife of this remarkable book today and some of the possibilities with community collaboration and fieldwork that I'm now embarking on. For those of you who don't know this region, this is 𝗭ლი in Peru. As you can see on the right, it's on the shore of Lake Titicaca, and this is the town where this book was composed and published. The Aymara language is spoken sort of in the area where Peru and Bolivia and Chile meet, and this is a map based on census data about how widely spoken it is in various districts. So you can see it really centers around Lake Titicaca and really around today around the town of 𝗭ლი . And this is here where I'm going to talk about where this text comes from. 𝗭ლი was really a sort of a center of linguistic research and production in the early colonial period. And this unfolded in a context more broadly of writing in indigenous Andean languages between the sort of the first arrival of the Spaniards until the middle of the 17th century. Now, much of what was written in these languages, like Quechua and Aymara, was composed by missionaries for the purposes of converting the local population to Catholicism. And so this is sort of an example of what some of these documents look like. In addition to these sort of religious documents, there were other kinds of texts that were written as well, like dictionaries. For instance, this is written by the Jesuit priest Ludovico Bertonio, who also composed the book that I'm going to talk about today, also published in 1612. This is a massive, it's sort of a 900-page dictionary, which is still the best and most comprehensive dictionary that we have for the Aymara language even today. And then also a grammatical study of the language written by the same Jesuit missionary during the same period. All of this came out of this town of 𝗭ლი These texts are a very specific type of text. They are for European purposes, and they are analytical texts which discuss the grammar and the lexicons of these languages. But they don't say much about the way that these languages were actually spoken by the people who use these languages. And that's quite a bit more difficult to learn about during the colonial period. The closest thing that comes to mind is the 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗀𝗺 manuscript, which, and I should say that Frank Solomon is with us now, and he's done the research on this particular fascinating text, which was written by a Quechua speaker named 𝗪χτόβαλ-τσόκε-κάσσα around 1608. And this is sort of the closest thing that I can think of to a precedent for sort of a book-length work like the Aymara Vida Christi, in the sense that it was actually composed by a speaker of Aymara. Unlike in Mesoamerica, which during the colonial period had this fluorescence of indigenous writing, in the Andean and South American contexts, this is much more rare to find speakers of native languages writing in those languages, and particularly not at this length. So the text that I'm going to talk about today is really unusual and special for that reason. So this is the book here that I'm going to talk about. Just to describe it briefly, it has 51 chapters, each sort of telling a different episode about the life of Jesus Christ. And so it is a religious text, of course, though it is transformed into a sort of a work of Aymara verbal art in some senses, and that's what I'm going to talk about. It's about 550 pages long, and it's about 75,000 Aymara words. which is really just makes it an extraordinary corpus of linguistic and cultural material. And so, but it hasn't received much attention, with the exceptions of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Ivan Tavel, who are linguists who have done a bit of research on this book, but much remains unstudied about this. So, and it's a massive amount of Aymara writing. So I just want to look at this title for a moment. It's a very long, complicated title, but I want to just pull out a couple elements here. It's about the life of Jesus Christ, translated from the one, that is to say, a previous book compiled by Alonso de Villegas, with some things removed and added and accommodated to the capacity of the native people. So I want to talk about specifically what that last sort of phrase means, because it's really significant for understanding what this book is like. So what this title refers to is the process of translation from this earlier Spanish book published in 1591 in Spanish called the Floss Song, which includes this text about the life of Christ. So this was translated from Spanish into Aymara. But what's really interesting and unusual about this text is that the Spanish, the Aymara book is actually 2 columns, and the left column on every page is Aymara. So it went from Spanish in 1591 to Aymara in the left column in 1612, but then it was retranslated from Aymara back into Spanish. Which is just, I'm not really aware of a sort of a precedent for this sort of structure. It's really unusual and really interesting. One of the most interesting things about this is that the Spanish on either side don't resemble each other at all. It's really remarkable how much change has happened in this game of telephone. Because indeed the Aymara translator made major changes to the Spanish text. So what kind of changes did the Aymara speaker make? And fortunately, we have Ludovico Bertonio, the Jesuit who oversaw this project. He wrote this very long, detailed description of how he intended and how he did the translation process, and how and what his goals were and what his methods were. So it's sort of like a methodology section almost. It's really extraordinary to find it laid out so clearly and in such detail from this period. I just want to quote him a little bit here so we know what we're talking about. He writes, because this is a narrative text. It's supposed to be an exemplar of the way that Aymara speakers would have expressed themselves. So he writes, regarding the elegance, and that's a major word here that I want to focus on, this elegance. Regarding the elegance of what is written here in the Aymara language, it is necessary to know, dear reader, that I did not take this from my own knowledge, since I was not born in this land, but rather in Italy. And no matter how much I might have learned of Aymara, I would not presume so much of myself that I would offer myself as a teacher of the elegance with which the native people speak it. And here he refers repeatedly to the elegance of the language. Now this comes in contrast to the dictionary that he published and the grammatical description that he published. And he found himself capable of presenting these sort of analytical kind of texts. But when it comes to the way that to capturing the elegance of the Aymara language as it was used by its speakers, Bertonio passed that job along to a speaker of Aymara. He goes on and describes why this is important. He says, the elegant gowns, to give an example, of the Flemish are elegant among them because it's their style. But that same thing would provoke laughter among the Spanish because they're not used to those kinds of gowns. So he's really talking about the aesthetics of language use, which beyond issues of grammar and lexicon can differ and vary between languages and between speakers of languages. So he wants to capture the aesthetic of Aymara language use in this text. For this reason, he writes, we asked a native person from this town of 𝗭ლი𝗵 by the name of Martín de Santa Cruz-Hanansaya to help translate it from Spanish to Aymara. So here is the name of this man, Don Martín de Santa Cruz-Hanansaya, published right here in the book. It is highly unusual, as far as I'm aware, to see the name of a native person in the colonial period who gave their intellectual labor to a language text like this. I'm not aware of other cases where these people are named explicitly and acknowledged for their linguistic labor. But here he is, Don Martín de Santa Cruz-Hanansaya. So the question that I want to ask in this project is, what did, in fact, Martín de Santa Cruz consider to be elegant Aymara? That's right. That was the job that Bertonio asked of Martín de Santa Cruz. What exactly did elegant Aymara mean? By comparing the 1591 Spanish original with the 1612 Aymara translation, we can find out what exactly Martín de Santa Cruz considered to be elegant. So that's what I'm doing in this project, is taking this 1591 Spanish book and putting it alongside the Quechua translation, and really sort of not sentence by sentence, because it's not literally translated, but sort of text by bits of text, comparing and trying to understand what sort of interventions and innovations Martín de Santa Cruz made in the course of his translation. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of these innovations that were made by Martín de Santa Cruz. And as I said, there's so many of them to talk about, and so I may not get to all of them here. But one that I want to talk about is recorded speech and dialogue. And those of us here who work with native Andean languages, and there are several of us here I see in the list, this is, of course, a really important fact about Quechua and Aymara discourse. The heavy use of reported speech. I want to give an example, just a very quick, easy, simple example here. Here's the Spanish 1591 original. The Virgin Mary gave birth without pain, which was translated into Aymara here. This part about without pain is translated as without saying ouch. That's how Martín de Santa Cruz expressed the idea of without pain, without saying ouch. Throughout this text, Martín de Santa Cruz has introduced lots of dialogue and direct quotes of the various characters in the narrative that gives it this very dialogic quality. And sort of the events are, and in particular, internal emotions, internal psychological states are not expressed as such as they are in Spanish, but rather in terms of what people said, rather than what they experienced. So this is a much more of a quotation-heavy translation, which makes it completely different in many ways. Another example that I want to give has to do with epistemic and evidential marking. Those of us who work in Andean languages, of course, know about this as well. This is an important part of the grammatical system of these languages. This example is a little bit more complex, but I'll try to get into it here. Here's the Spanish original, in which King Herod, and I guess it helps to know a little bit about this Bible story. King Herod had heard that the baby Jesus has been born and was threatened by this threat to his power, so he wanted to collect information. So King Herod asked the three kings to go and worship the new king and to come back through Jerusalem, because he, King Herod, would go later and do the same. This is his surveillance reconnaissance mission. Here is the Aymara version. I didn't put it in the full Aymara just because there's so much here, but So we start here with the voice of the narrator, Martín de Santa Cruz. Herod told the three kings, all right, and then we switch to a different voice. Quote, "Go there on my behalf," he says to the three kings. And then once you have worshiped him, come back here and tell me. And then Herod here quotes the three kings. The Messiah was born, or he wasn't born. So in other words, we have a case of embedded reported speech here, where where Martín de Santa Cruz, the Aymara speaker, writes about Herod, and Herod speaks, and then Herod then quotes the three kings. What's interesting about the Aymara translation here is that all of the different figures in this complex interplay of voices are given different kinds of evidential and epistemic morphology. So for instance, in the voice of Martín de Santa Cruz, the Aymara speaker, Herod told the three kings, this is the non-experienced past suffix, so-called. In other words, the Aymara speaker was not there to experience Herod saying this. So our Aymara speakers reports this event without having experienced them. Herod told the three kings. But when Herod quotes the three kings, they say the Messiah was born or he wasn't born, and this bears the personal experience suffix, because indeed they went and found the baby and saw and visited and saw with their own eyes that he either was or was not born. So what you get here is you get these different levels, this embedded hierarchy of reported speech, in which each person in the narrative is attributed a different experience upon these events. And it's something that's completely absent in the Spanish original. So this is just sort of a part of the morphosyntax of the Aymara language. But in this case, it adds this whole other level and richness really to the text, where people are, the various characters are attributed sort of evidence and experience about who knew about which events and when, and whether they knew them personally or through hearsay. So, excuse me, you get a much richer sort of picture of the intersubjectivity of the characters in the narrative that's completely introduced by Martín de Santa Cruz, the Aymara speaker, and exists in almost every sentence. So it's remarkable. Okay. One of the things that I think is totally fascinating about this book is the frequent references to local plants, animals, and places. So this text, the Vita Christi, was meant to be read by Aymara speakers who had never been to Judea, to the Mediterranean. They didn't know the social and cultural context of these stories. And so what Martín de Santa Cruz does is he introduces a lot of points of comparison with the local colonial Andean context to understand what's going on in this text. So here's an example. Here, somebody's being mistreated, and they're mixing something into their beverage. They call it hiel in Spanish here, in the 1591 original. Excuse me, which is supposed to be an unpleasant thing to drink. So how does Martín de Santa Cruz translate this term? He uses the terms 𝗔hilka and catacora, which are both native Andean plants that don't exist in the old world. So here, Martín de Santa Cruz has referenced Andean plants to make the sort of biblical context more intelligible to Aymara speakers. This is 𝗔hilka, this plant that exists in the Andes. Another case that I really think is fascinating has to do with sociolinguistic comments about the social context of the biblical world here. So in the 1591 Spanish original, it says, St. Peter spoke in the Galilean Aramaic style. This was the language spoken by St. Peter, apparently, which was considered rural and backward among the Israelites. So my translation. In the original, I'm sorry, in the Aymara translation, he says, St. Peter spoke as if he was eating. That's sort of the description of how he pronounces words. That's sort of the articulation associated with this stigmatized variety of language. He spoke as if he was eating, and with a different language, the language of those from Galilee, which is like the Pukina here. And so the Pukina is a language that was spoken at that time, no longer, but at that time it was widely spoken, but it was sort of had at that point become a sort of a stigmatized and minoritized language in this context. So you can see here, Martín de Santa Cruz is presenting this Bible story in a way that would be intelligible to Aymara speakers in the Aymara speaking world. One of the really fascinating aspects of the translation has to do with the poetic structure of how the actual sort of narrative unfolds, which is quite different from the Spanish original. And so let's see here. I want to just give an example here because it's a bit of a complex topic to describe. But this part of the Spanish text is describing how Jesus was brought towards the crucifixion, and it says the haste with which they carried him was such that many times they dropped him on the floor and picked him up very roughly. This was translated into Aymara as, and they hurried him toward the town. And I'm sorry, as they hurried him toward the town, they kept on making him fall down. And once he fell down, they picked him back up again without being careful. So what's interesting here is this repetition of the verb to fall down. This is something that you see throughout this text, is that it's what we call tail-head linkages in linguistics. That is the tail of this last discourse unit is then linked to the head of the next one. This is sort of used as this kind of poetic structuring device through which the events unfold. And it's totally absent in the Spanish text, but it's my suspicion is that it's widespread in the Andean languages. And so one question that I'm asking is whether this can still be found in Aymara narratives today, which would not surprise me. You find it in Western Amazonia, for instance. So I hope that's clear. This is a bit of a complex example, but you see this. He does one thing, and then then pause, and then once he did this one thing, then he did this other thing, and so this how these events in the narrative are sort of stitched together in this very particular way, using this very specific morpheme in Aymara. Okay, so. Another aspect that I want to point out here is the use of metaphor, which is quite innovative. There's a lot of metaphorical innovation on the part of Martín de Santa Cruz in the Aymara. Let me give an example here. She didn't do anything wrong. Even the leftover dirt under the fingernail, that is even a little bit, even a little tiny bit. This is a turn of phrase that appears throughout the text. Anytime sort of you want to refer to a little tiny bit of something, it's they talk about the leftover dirt under the fingernail, and that's just a way of saying a tiny bit. I'm now beginning to work with Aymara speakers, and one of the really interesting things is to use this as sort of an elicitation tool. Have you heard? Does this mean anything to you? And the Aymara speakers that I'm currently working on this with don't recognize these kinds of turns of phrase. Some of them say it sounds vaguely familiar. It's like something that their grandparents would say, but that it's not a current turn of phrase among Aymara speakers. So I think this represents sort of a really interesting catalog of kind of metaphorical language that we can find in Aymara. Another really interesting example of these sort of metaphorical uses of language has to do with the directional suffixes. In Aymara, there's a really rich repertoire of derivational suffixes which describe actions as going up or going down or going through or happening in multiple places at the same time or going around an object. For instance, this is 𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗵𝗃. We have the verb 𝗧𝗧𝗃𝗵𝗃, to walk around something to the other side. So this is like if you were standing in front of a tree, you would walk sort of in this 180-degree, or is that what it is? Kind of an arc around the tree and get to the other side. And that's what this 𝗶𝗶𝗃 represents. But you see it, so you see it with verbs, directional verbs, like to walk. Obviously you can walk in a particular direction, but you also see it metaphorically used with non-directional verbs, like 𝗭𝗏𝗃𝗵𝗃, to speak around or to deceive someone. So I think what's interesting here is that with these kinds of directional morphology, you can create all these kinds of new types of metaphorical usages, which I think reflect this really innovative and creative use of directional morphology in Aymara. I think this may be something that Josh would be interested in because he does work on space in Quechua, and so I'd be interesting to know if there's metaphorical extensions of these kinds of spatial phenomena as well in Quechua. So that's one thing, is that I want to sort of develop this understanding of how metaphor worked in this Aymara text and how it has or has not changed. Again, these are a bit unfamiliar to Aymara speakers today, as far as I can gather. Another aspect that I think is interesting to draw attention to is sound symbolism, and in particular idiophones. Martín de Santa Cruz has introduced into this text a great deal of idiophones, that is sort of sounds that represent sensory phenomenon like splat or buzz, and sort of have an iconic relationship with what they represent. These are, those of us who study Andean languages know that these are widespread in the Andes and also in all over Amazonia as well. But what's interesting is that Martín de Santa Cruz uses a lot of these things in contexts in which they don't exist in the Spanish original. So here's an example. Whereas there's just a reference to thunder in the 1591 Spanish original, the thunder is actually voiced in the Aymara. In the Aymara translation, 𝗭𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. This is an unusual. This does not really fit the phonotactics. This is not a usually allowed kind of sound in Aymara. This double O, it's very unusual. So 𝗭𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. So you actually hear the thunder in the Aymara text in a way that you don't in the Spanish text, and that's a general property of the Aymara translation, is that it's filled up with the sounds of the events in question. So I just want to show a few examples to show just how rich the idiophones are in this text. We have 𝗀𝗀𝗀 for hammering. We have 𝗀𝗀𝗀 for a horse walking slowly. However, when the horse starts to gallop, we find 𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗏. When a sheep walks through water, we hear 𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 in this text. When a stone is thrown into deep water, we hear 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏, which is a sound that doesn't exist in Aymara, that trilled 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏, which is interesting because it sort of violates the phonology of Aymara, as idiophones often do. 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏 is a stone thrown not into deep water, but onto land, whereas 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is a stone thrown onto another stone. We find 𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗏 for the sound of two pieces of wood being rubbed together, but 𝗧𝗑𝗧𝗧𝗧 for the sound of when someone walks, when their pant legs rub together. That is 𝗭ญ่𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫. So this is just a remarkably rich text for understanding what Martín de Santa Cruz, how he encoded his world in ideophones. 𝗁𝗁, the sound of a dangerous spirit walking by at night. So again, here, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to work with Aymara speakers in this region to understand which of these ideophones persist and which ones don't, and what they sound like to speakers of Aymara today, which makes for, I think, a really interesting sort of intergenerational, intercentury kind of language documentation project, which is what I have planned. Okay, so I want to move on to the last bit here and talk about the life of this text today in 𝗏𝗏 and generally in the Aymara speaking world. Unless anybody wants to interject with some questions or comments, in which case that's fine as well. But I'll just continue on here if nobody wants to interject. This is the town of 𝗏𝗏 today, and you can see in the middle of the town, the central plaza in the town is Plaza Ludovico Bretonio. The whole identity of this place is really built around this towering linguistic scholar, Ludovico Bretonio, who did this important work in the 17th century. So much so that here we have a bust, a statue of Ludovico Bretonio right here in the center of the town. But one of the sort of tragic aspects of this material is that it's not available to Aymara speakers today. There are about 10 copies of the Vita Christi, and they are scattered all throughout sort of libraries throughout the world. Only one of which is in South America, in Lima. The vocabulario, the dictionary that Ludovico Bretonio wrote is very well known, but some of his other works are not. And I think that it's a shame that this fascinating text and the voice of Martín de Santa Cruz himself is not available and not accessible to Aymara speakers today. So one of the things that I'm working on is a digital interface where this entire text is available to Aymara speakers and to anyone who wants to use it digitally. This part of the project is still in its infancy, but the idea is to have an online interface for not only for the Vita Christi, but for all of the documents, all of these interesting texts produced by Ludovico Bretonio, in particular the dictionary and the Vita Christi, because put together they're a really fascinating combination. The dictionary in large part was compiled from the Vita Christi, and so there's a lot of connections between the dictionary and the Vita Christi that can be drawn out, but not as books. There has to be, the internet is sort of ideally suited for this, a digital interface where you can look at a particular word or grammatical structure or tagged sort of socio-political or cultural concept that brings up all the instances of it throughout the entire corpus. So that's what we're working on developing now. And the idea is that it will be available once again after 400 long years to speakers of Aymara. And then there's also a fieldwork component of this project, which haven't begun this really in earnest yet because of the pandemic. But the idea is to work with Aymara speakers on a sort of language documentation project to understand what it is that this interesting corpus can offer them, and what a sort of Aymara speaker hears and sees in these documents, culturally and linguistically, and how they might attest to earlier periods in the language. So that's sort of the next step in this project. Is to do some work in 𝗏𝗏 would be the most natural place for it, but I'm also starting fieldwork virtually with speakers that are elsewhere in the Aymara speaking world. So I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities that that lie ahead in the integration of this digital interface, and also with the integration of historical text and modern fieldwork and language documentation kinds of methods and goals. So that's where we are with this project. I thought I would just, I guess I'll just end there. And if anybody would like to talk about it, I would love to have any sort of input that you might have. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. So we've got time for questions and answers now. And we did have one question already from David Dinwoody in the chat. If you want to turn on your video and ask that would be great.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicholas. That was great. And I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to know as much as you do. But I guess one question that started coming into my mind as you were talking is to what extent maybe the literature on Bible translation might be helpful for just thinking about what this stylistic project was all about. And so like the simplest contrast to me would be sort of between, say, Martin Luther's effort and you know, a very Protestant effort that that was focused on somehow making the content of the Bible accessible to the common person. And but another alternative, the Oblate priests up in the region where I work, and they're kind of similar in some ways to the Jesuits. And I don't have a document like this, but I think in terms of hymns and things like that, their impulse was the opposite. In other words, they weren't striving for something like translational transparency. They're seeking something more like awe, right? They want something that's going to not necessarily be readily intelligible, but be impressive and powerful in kind of more of a Orthodox Catholic sense. You see what I mean? And so I'm wondering, have you thought about that? In other words, do you think this project, given the time frame, Luther's translation is available to some people, but it seems to me counterintuitive that this would be a Luther-like project. Anyway, go ahead.
That's a fascinating, really insightful observation, and so thank you for that. That's and I don't know. I guess the answer is I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what the context is in which these kinds of texts that the Jesuits would want these kinds of texts to be intelligible and readable. Ultimately, I suppose or at least read aloud to. So I don't know how to sort of fit that into where that fits in the context of religious history in this region at this moment with the Jesuits. But what I can say is that because I should say that also this is such a complex project because it's linguistic. On the one hand, it's a very technical kind of linguistic project, but it also brings in all of these religious concepts as well as the local sort of social and cultural context. So it's a very multidisciplinary project. And this is one of the disciplines that it brings in. And so I do need to sort of to come to terms with these kinds of religious questions. And this is one thing that I'm struggling with. If we take Bertonio's own words in the introduction, he says some really fascinating things on this topic. He writes a critique of his missionary, his co-missionaries in the colonial Andes, and says that a dictionary and a grammatical description are not enough for the purposes of saving souls. He says that in order, if you truly want to reach Aymara or speakers of any native language in the Andes, what you need is not just the grammatical description and the dictionary and whatever accompanying religious texts you have. If you really want to reach them, you need to reach them in a way and through language that will inspire them to dig deeper and to understand more fully. Otherwise, it's not a deep engagement with the religious concepts. So he's very explicit about this in his critique of other missionaries who have attempted to just use the grammar and the vocabulary, and instead says you need to figure out the pragmatics. Really, is what he's talking about, the cultural pragmatics of language use and how people express themselves and the metaphor. And you have to, if you really want to reach Aymara speakers, you have to translate this, you have to transform it into a work of Aymara verbal art. And so the purpose is very explicitly religious for this type of text. But where that fits into the whole religious context in this period is something I don't know enough about and should. So your insights on this are really helpful, and so thank you.
Well, thank you.
So I think there's a couple other people with questions. Yeah, Benjamin had his hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I just want to preface with, I am an evolutionary plant biologist, so excuse my ignorance if this is beyond the scope of your work. But given the last question, it really made me think about, what do we know about Martín de Santa Cruz and kind of why he may have been chosen for this service? And then also, like, was he an otherwise religious leader or, you know, spiritual leader in the community, and how we can maybe understand the words and the metaphor and all of that he used in the context of this, you know, just kind of keeping in mind that this is only one data point. And so how do we understand where his vocabulary was coming from? And thinking that this may be possible because you said in that methods section, they named him by name, and that maybe there's more information. So
yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, it's an excellent question. The answer is that Bertonio does write more about Martín de Santa Cruz. He writes that he is sort of an influential figure in the mission orbit, that he lived in 𝗭ლი in the Jesuit mission, and that there was a school for children, excuse me, and that Martín de Santa Cruz grew up attending the mission school. So from a young age, he was exposed to the religious context and also to the Spanish language, but that he was ultimately a member of the Aymara society around him as well. So he was functioned as a very competent intermediary, so that when for instance, you know, when he came upon, I'm trying to think of a good example, but when he came upon a really complex religious concept in the original text, of which there are every other sentence, he knew enough about the concepts to be able to render this into an Aymara form. So who was he? I don't really know much about it. I mean, maybe it's possible to dig into church records somehow. And I see Frank Solomon here is nodding his head. And that's another step here that I think would be really interesting to do, and should try to figure out more about who this person was. But in terms of the translation project, and this is actually relevant to the previous question as well, Bertonio describes letting Martín de Santa Cruz just sort of take over the entire translation enterprise, but also, excuse me, sort of looking over his shoulder to make sure that he stayed within the confines of Catholic doctrine. That is, that he did not want Martín de Santa Cruz to introduce concepts or imagery or anything that sort of contradicted the religious principles of that Bertonio was trying to express. So, so my sense is that Martín de Santa Cruz was a particular. Bertonio really goes and describes just how smart and how capable and curious and industrious Martín de Santa Cruz was. So the impression that I get from this few sentences really in the introduction is that he was a very adept linguistic consultant, I suppose is how we might talk about it now, or and also an author in his own right, and that he was well positioned because he was exposed to both societies. As for how representative, that's really is N equals 1 here. And so as a language documentation project, it's not ideal. But 400 years later, it's you take what you can get, I suppose. So yes, how much of this might have been his own sort of personal creativity, how much it was sort of a more widespread aspects of the aesthetics of language across the region is difficult to know. And like you said, how much of it is owes to his own particular sort of position of leadership and esteem in this kind of privileged place in the mission. All questions that may be possible to address from various sides through court records. I'm sorry, church records of some sort. But that's something that would require a trip to Peru soon, hopefully. And is a really important part of this equation. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's wonderful history.
Yeah.
Great questions so far. I'm trying to keep up with the questions and coming through. So I think next was Frank Solomon, and then Chris Chavez, and then we'll go to Kendrick McCabe's question, then Carl Swinehart and Austin Howard after that. So Frank, go ahead. Oh, you're muted. You've got to unmute. There
okay, sorry. I just want to get at a detail from the last round of discussion about the consultant's name. His name, Martín de Santa Cruz Hanansaya, does not sound like a fully personal name. Well, it's likely to be a sort of professional name. Hanansaya signals a position in political hierarchies. That is, he's affiliated with one rather than the other moiety of his place. But this name leaves me with a feeling of ellipsis. I wonder, could it be that he was a contemporary or even an acquaintance of Juan de Santa Cruz 𝗵𝗲𝗃𝗍𝗵𝗃𝗃? 𝗵𝗲𝗃𝗍𝗵𝗃 gives a fuller version of his name, which sounds like it makes more allusions than just a political affiliation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. Let me rewind here and show you a little bit more about the context here. There's more that I didn't read here. He's del Ayllu Cara, bien conocido de la provincia. So his Ayllu is also identified here. But not much else really. So that sounds entirely possible to me, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. That would be really interesting to know. Perhaps you can give me some hints about where I might be able to track down that sort of information if it's possible to find, and what that connection might mean, because it sounds really notable. Yeah. So that would be great. Thank you, Frank.
So let's see, Chris, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. You know, when you're looking at that his name, there's a name, the small letters Don. So he must have been a pretty good native to accept that the name Don, because in Spain they used that Don Jose, Don Diego, that is a very respected name. So this person probably took the church as a full acceptance in his beliefs. I believe that he probably interpreted through a sacristant position, where up here in New Mexico, the Pueblos, there are connections with the natives and the church, and they're called sacristans. And that's not connected with the tribal beliefs here. So if we had to translate it, it would not be translatable. So it was physically manifested as a part of a conquest through the church. So my question is, did you look into his position with both sides of his native position and his church position? So my thought on that is he accepted the full church policies or philosophy.
Yeah, that's my impression as well, is that he was a member of this mission and a member of esteem and authority in the mission context. As for specifically what kinds of social relations he maintained outside of the mission or even within the mission, I don't know the answer. The only thing published that I can find that mentions him or anything about his life is this chapter of this book, and I think that learning more about the specific details of who he was and what his position was vis-a-vis the mission and the broader Aymara society will require a trip to Peru, a very exciting one, in which we sort of go after on the trail of Don Martín de Santa Cruz Hanansaya to try to figure out who he was. But currently, this is sort of a linguistic project without that sort of historical detail, which I hope that will be possible to add at some point.
Thank you.
Kendrick, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hello. My name's Kendrick. I'm a grad student, so we're just going to assume that I know nothing. And the reason I asked this question is because we just read Greg Urban not too long ago in Dr. Rhodes's class regarding originators and copiers and the relationship between them and this aspect of power. And I'm curious, with it being at least conceived as Aymara art in its linguistic form, is there also that aspect that it is a transformed copy, at least in that sense? Because it kind of reminds, what you're discussing kind of reminds me of the Navajo Bible on the Navajo reservation. It is not like perfectly or linguistically translated. They take a lot of same notions of like sounds and concepts that didn't exist back then, and then this further dynamic of power between the Catholic Church and the Navajo people, and then the originators and copiers, I suppose, taking a copy of the Bible and then making a copy of the Navajo language and then creating something. I suppose I'm curious to you if you would see this instance in your research as being an original or a copy of a copy.
Well, let's see. I mean, that's a really interesting, yeah. That's a really interesting theoretical and analytical question. It's been a while regarding the text that you mentioned, so I'm not sure I can speak to that specifically. But is it a copy? Well, I guess for whom, I guess, is the question. Bertonio is, I mean, it's great because he really tells us very specifically how he intended this, and he intended this as a way for Aymara speakers to learn about the life of Jesus in a manner that accounted for the linguistic aesthetic sensibilities that they would bring to bear on interpreting any narrative that they came across. So, so is it a copy? Yes, you know, I suppose in a way that's how this was produced by taking the 1591 text and, if not sentence for sentence, certainly paragraph by paragraph, transforming it from one to the other. But Bertonio and I suppose Martín de Santa Cruz also thought about this as very explicitly not a copy, because something important was introduced into it, and that is the cultural context in which Aymara speakers would be able to engage with this text meaningfully and intelligibly. So in a very significant sense, it is also not a copy. So that's yeah. So I'm not sure quite how to address the specific theoretical question that you raised, but that's my impression here, is that it was a copy in a sort of a literal sense in which it was copied, and it's reproduces this 51 chapters about the life of Christ, but it's very explicitly a non-copy in the sense that it introduces something entirely new.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Let's see. Carl Swinehart, do you want to unmute and ask the question that you had? Hey.
Hey, Carl.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hello. Thanks so much, Nick, for this amazing work that you're doing, and particularly the links with the community in Peru that you're making and doing such an important service to them. And thanks a lot also for to the University of New Mexico Anthropology Department, all the colleagues there that are allowing people like me who aren't there to come in and learn from Nick. That last comment and question is related in a way to mine. I mean, these processes of analogy that go on, the example you give of Galilean lengua tosca becoming Puquina in the Andean context, and sort of how these different analogies get created of likeness across context is fascinating. I'm reminded even of seeing early colonial maps of the Andes where the Spanish marked off huacas as mezquitas, saying that these were mosques, only, with the expulsion of the Moors being in memory. But I'm curious, where else, I mean, as that kind of approach of looking at who would be the rural and backward, oh, it's the Puquinas, this is fascinating. But what about Caesar, or even thinking about gender relations like Mary Magdalene, or like, are there, how was the Roman Empire discussed? Did they talk about Rome, or were there other, is that same approach? Is there, are you able to look at other parts of this text in a similar way, or come up with analogies?
Yeah, this is a really great question. Thank you, Carl. Yes, indeed. It takes some close reading. I mean, this is a sort of a very, both of the, in particular, the one about the bitter herb example is very obvious, because you look at it and the word here is iel, and over here it's chilca and catacora. So that there's been a sort of an adaptation to the local Aymara ecology and culture. In other cases, and with the Puquina, that just jumps right off the page. I think my impression is that the other kinds of analogies, as you put it very well, I think, are more, some of them are very direct and obvious and explicit, and then others are much more subtle in the way that power and is expressed, like you said, and birth and motherhood, and because there's a lot about the family, and the journey, what an experience of a journey is like. There's the wise men or travel and follow the star, and what does the star look like? What is the shimmering of a star? How is that expressed in this case with ideophones? And so if you really read between the lines very carefully, you can really find some of those kinds of analogies which are more implicit in the text, and by contrast to those that are much more explicit, like the ones that I mentioned. And so that's sort of an unsatisfactory answer to your excellent question, Carl. But the answer is yes. There are obvious ones, and there are less obvious ones. And in some senses, I think the less obvious ones are the most interesting ones, though they also require a lot more context, a little bit more religious understanding of how some of these things, and also like a broader political understanding of the context of the Roman Empire, which is another aspect of this, of which I'm not as strong as in other aspects. So yes, the answer is yes, Carl, that there are a great many things that will emerge and will be, a very deep, careful, close, and I would probably say lifetime reading of this text, of these two texts together, will yield quite a number of interesting insights along similar lines to what you described.
Thanks for another great question. So we had another from Austin Howard. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Okay.
Hey, Austin.
Hello, yes, thank you. It was a really excellent talk. So, sorry, my lighting's not so great. I had two questions really quickly. One was on the idiophones. I do some work on idiophones. I wanted to know, are they mainly sort of onomatopoeia, such as imitating animal sounds, like sound to sound, or are the mappings also onto emotions and things like this, emotional states? Do you see like a particular ratio of that? And if so, do you think that working with contemporary populations, you will see the same ratio, or that they'll be stable, or that they'll have changed? Because there's a lot of talk about how idiophones may or may not change over time based on historical processes. And I had a quick question about stereotypes in the text. Do you see stereotypes of particular peoples? I think this piggybacks off the last question a bit. Do you see that particular groups are portrayed in specific ways related to, say, geography or gender, etc., things like that?
Right. Interesting. Thank you very much, Austin. Let's see. So the first question, idiophones, what kinds of sensory phenomena do they tend to represent? And that's a really interesting question. It's kind of hard. You kind of have to stumble across these things as I translate this text. And they are ubiquitous, but my feeling so far is that most of them tend to represent sound. And I do similar work with 𝗏𝗏 spoken in the Amazon in Arawak language, where the idiophones tend to also cross all kinds of sensory modalities. So the experience of light makes a particular idiophonic sound. But in this particular text, I've only come across, I think, sound idiophones. Though it'd be really interesting to know if there are more. So I will keep you posted about that. The question of how they change is really interesting. I can't wait for this part of the project. Just in my first sort of work with Aymara speakers now, some of these are known to Aymara speakers today, and many of them are not. And so what I would like to do is to do a little bit of idiophone dialectology and sort of see how these things are distributed around the region. Also, I'm collaborating with a colleague, Matt Kohler, at my university in Groningen, at the University of Groningen, and he had a really interesting idea. These things, idiophones pass between languages really easily. They're really subject to borrowing and language contact phenomena. One of the things that he proposed was to make recordings of Aymara speakers producing idiophones and nearby 𝗏𝗏 speakers, and to play them and do an experimental methodology to see if they can correctly identify what this particular idiophone represents, and to see if there's sort of an idiophonic aerial phenomenon that can emerge in South America as a result. That's sort of that's a sort of a tangential kind of side project to this main thing. And then to compare that with this document and see how these things may or may not have changed. And this text just offers so many fascinating possibilities. So The second question about stereotypes, that's a, you know, the 𝗶𝗂𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗾 part was really jumped out at me, that this would be the sort of the rural kind of variety, rural language spoken in the region that would be looked down upon, which is consistent with the way that 𝗶𝗂𝗵𝗿 is described in the linguistic historical literature. I'm not really aware of other cases of it, of this kind of phenomenon. But yeah, I think similar to what Carl raised, it would be really interesting to see the sort of analogies and to see what kind of social stereotypes can be teased out of the translation in that manner. So those are both really interesting ways forward, I think.
Thank you, very interesting.
Thanks, Austin.
Great, thank you. Suzanne, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thank you, Nick, for your talk. Really enjoyed it. Well, I want to ask you a question about the reported speech section of your talk.
Sure.
I think that, well, I found that so interesting because for Tupian speakers in lowland Brazil that I'm familiar with, that's definitely the way they also speak, that you don't really talk about someone's character or their psychological state. Instead, you either quote their speech or you describe their actions. So you would, even in Portuguese, where you could easily say someone is stingy, you'd say, no, that person withholds meat when someone asks them for it. So there is kind of an avoidance of thinking in terms of character or psychological state. So I guess I have two questions on that. One is, do people still speak like that in Aymara? Is there still that avoidance that you would really just quote someone's speech or maybe describe an action? And then I guess my second question is, and this might relate to Kate's in the chat, do you think that maybe you might have a little bit of a non-Christian concept of the person smuggled into this Christian text in this reported speech, given that, you know, so many people have said that our idea of interiority and a psychological personhood, you know, with an individual with an interior is very Christian, you know, from St. Augustine on, that this is, you know, where we've gotten this from, and this is only 1612, but still you're sort of well into this idea for the European concept of the person. And I guess I just wondered about that, if what you thought about those ideas.
Wow, okay, interesting. Thank you so much. Those are some very deep, rich questions. Okay, so let's see, the first one about the idiophones, no, I'm sorry, about the reported speech and about whether this is, right, about whether this is how Aymara speakers communicate still today, which is as far as I can tell, and what I've read in the sort of linguistic and linguistic anthropological literatures, that this across the Andes, this is indeed continues to be an important principle of expression in Quechua and Aymara. Though I have not done, I work with Quechua speakers in southern Peru, but not with Aymara speakers yet, or I'm just beginning to now. And Carl, who is with us now, he works very closely with Aymara speakers, so he may have other ideas about this. But my impression is that this remains, and also from the ethnographic literature, this remains an important principle for how internal kind of psychological states are described by Aymara speakers. But I don't know. I have not done that research myself, and I would hesitate to rule too much on that. And so your second question about the interiority of the self and the concept of the self. Yes, am I smuggling in that concept? That's highly likely, I would say.
Well, not you. I mean him, the author, the translator, the Santa Cruz. That maybe it's not so much you, but him. Like maybe not even intentionally, but that one could see a little non-Christian self-person idea in this text.
I see. Yeah, okay, interesting. I see what you mean now. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to give a satisfactory answer to your question.
It looks like Frank Solomon in the chat wrote something really interesting, that Jesuits were attentive to religious interiority at that time. So Santa Cruz would have been familiar and almost obliged to address it. So that's really cool. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Can I refer you to Frank? Would you mind responding to that? I would love to. I can't. I'm sorry. I have trouble following the chat and the conversation at the same time. So
Yeah.
I would love to know what Frank said in the chat.
Well, I was referring to the fact that this work was done at a moment when works advocating religious self-reflection and interiority were very popular in Christian print, and perhaps on the more philosophical edge of that discussion, Jesuit print. Well, Franciscans tended to veer more toward what we would call the spiritual or intuitive sense of interiority. It is very likely that in the convent circles where Don Martin lived, he would have seen and heard discussion about it. And it was characteristic of Jesuit that at that time to use interior development as a criterion of true conversion, as opposed to simple obedience to the catechetical regimen. And so just thinking of the cultural climate of that time and place, and the reason why people at that time would want to read a Vita Christi, it seems almost inevitable that there would have been some bridging of that contrast. But I want to postpone because I just don't know what lies on the other side of that bridge. What could we suppose to be an Aymara image, or an Aymara tendency in thinking about thinking?
Thank you, Susan, for your question, and for Frank for your answer. It was great. I should say also, Josh, I've completely ignored the chat. So would you let me know if I've missed something?
Yeah, no, I'm keeping an eye on that. And actually, Kate Rhodes had a question for you as well. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, that'd be great.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you for your talk. I think we've crossed paths, but I don't know if we've ever formally met. So nice to meet you.
Likewise.
So I work in the Yucatan, and reported speech also is very important there as well. And I'm currently working on a project. So I work at a university where linguistics is being taught, but each Maya, so in the Maya language. So courses on morphology, syntax, semantics are being taught in Maya. And I hear people all the time talk about how Western academic thought is really different from Maya ways of knowing, Maya ways of thinking. People become kind of de-Mayanized through higher education. And so I'm currently working on a project on, well, what is this kind of Maya way of knowing that people are feeling like is in conflict with or being kind of taught out of them through higher education? And so, and I've read a little bit about this work in other parts of the world through kind of literary analysis, which I think comes to bear on what you're working on. And I'm interested in the notion of kind of getting at this idea that, that Professor Solomon was talking about with kind of the other side of the bridge. And so to what extent do you think you can get at sort of a cosmovision or worldview, perhaps through how analogy and metaphor, how these similarities and contrasts are being drawn in this text? And then do you think you can take that and look for any of that kind of through contemporary ethnographic work today?
Thank you for another very rich question. My sort of intuition about that, or at least my my instinct, is to start at a very sort of basic empirical level, to try to get at that kind of thing, and to start from, for instance, the metaphorical extension of directional suffixes and idiophones, and the way that particular plants are analogized, the way that's meteorological phenomena described in the Bible story.
Fuck these bitches and I'm fucking all these hoes. I'm eating pussy like it's Oreo. You already know. You already fucking know, bitch. Hey! Got all this paper, I don't go to class. Shorty look good with that double stuffed ass. Shoe made it gated, so I'll see you later. Your boy meant to fade all. Your shit is trash. She only a 5.
Were we still, was that, I think
Yeah,
that was
sorry
that what
about
we
that.
covered?
Yeah, there was I don't know where that was coming from, but don't
Sorry.
worry, be happy it's gone.
Fair enough. Okay, so we're back here. Sorry, Caitlin. I'm sorry, Catherine, right? Catherine, yes. Sorry, that sort of interrupted my train of thought a bit here, but my intuition is to start low from an empirical kind of perspective and not build up too much sort of about a sort of broader cultural or sort of worldview type kinds of generalizations, except as those are connected very sort of concretely to what we can observe linguistically, which is quite a lot. What does it mean that Aymara has all these very complex directional distinctions in its morphology, and all these really complex metaphors are mapped onto these directional distinctions? There's something there that's culturally really important, obviously, to Martín de Santa Cruz. What is it, though, exactly? I don't know. I mean, beyond describing it and making it available to Aymara speakers, because it's now sort of hidden in this dense, impenetrable, rare text, I wouldn't know exactly how to generalize about these to sort of arrive at a kind of indigenous philosophy or kind of cultural worldview in a general sense. Maybe such a thing is possible. If anybody could do it, it would be Bruce, who I think also is with us, and I think has his hand raised maybe. But so that's my instinct, is to not is to start very low with the data and to work up, and maybe after maybe enough comes out of these 75,000 Aymara words that sort of a general cultural kind of pattern can be noted. But I'm afraid that I'm not far enough through them to be able to sort of to do something so ambitious. Though maybe one day it would be possible. If you know what I mean.
But that's good, my tongue like the taste. Ooh, how do you do that? Keep my shit wavy like do-rags. Make me your ex-man like 𝗎𝗫𝗫𝗫. I can't be your who, I'm a douchebag. Got so much drip, you kids might need a hoodie. Said I'm out here buzzing, but I got a woody. I've been in the field, but I feel like a
Sorry about that. Wherever that was coming from is yeah, it's masquerading as Frank Solomon. It's very strange. There's a couple of you on here now, and I don't know, maybe that's something that you should be concerned about as far as the security of your connection. I don't know, but I thought you should know that. Sorry, I'll try to keep those muted as they pop up though. But I lost if that was the end of that question.
I think Bruce has a question.
Yeah, Bruce, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to come back to the question of bridging between Roman Catholic interiority of the 17th century, particularly a Jesuit interiority, and an indigenous one. And I want to give you an example from Quechua, actually two examples that suggest that the attempts to bridge went in both directions. There were two different kinds of efforts, and the first of them is something that's familiar to anyone who's looked at 17th century religious texts in Quechua, presumably something very similar in Aymara, which is that the word for belief in the credo is translated as do you habitually say e, which essentially means do you assent to, but there isn't a way of talking about assent without a quotative. That's one side of it. The other side is something that I'm going to talk about from deep memory, which is that years ago I sat down with 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗵𝗃 and we read sermonals. And the thing at the time, people weren't working with sermonals. Since then, mainly Alan Durston has, and I think also Charles has worked with sermonals, but they were kind of treated as something that might be just about us and transparent. Well, the sermonal we worked with was a significant one for people working in is a significant one for people working in on colonial American languages, which is the sermonal by Avila, who we discovered was a pretty fair country theologian as well. In order to work through sermonal, you need a theological background. 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗃 had that, and you needed a linguistic background as well. And what we found there was that there was actually a sermon on mental representation of external events, which was kind of a surprise. And so that's the other side. The other side was actually trying to bring Jesuit ideas, in Avila's case, that's what they would have been theologically, into an Andean world. So.
This is great. Thank you, Bruce. As always, this is, and so I sort of have to generally apologize for my general lack of religious background here. I'm coming at this linguistically, and this is all really important and helpful context. So thank you, Bruce, and to everyone who has these interesting observations about this dimension of the material.
Thank you so much. I think we will end there. Something strange is happening where people are getting copied and used for Zoom bombing. So I'm very sorry about that interruption at the end. And want to end just by thanking Nick for sharing this fascinating work with us, and for everyone for the fantastic questions, and a little bit of applause. And I hope that in the future he can come and visit in person, and we can hear about where this research has gone in the next years. And I'd particularly love to hear about how the interface for connecting these works to Aymara speakers pans out, because that's a fantastic project. They could be expanded and replicated in all sorts of ways. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.